Dear Neve, hello, darling daughter. I thought I'd take this time to write to you. Well, I'm here on my own, I've got a comfortable place and nobody's listening. I'm in Copenhagen, it's great, and it's really, really cold. We were talking, I was actually having a conversation with my daughter. We were talking about websites, and we were talking about, she uses her phone a lot, she uses a lot of native apps and so on, and I said, you could use the web more, because this is what I do for a living. I'm your dad and you're supposed to care. And she said, but it all seems very slow and very complicated and not really what I want to do. Why is it like that? And I said, well, a lot of it is because of JavaScript. And she said, what does that mean? And I said, well, you don't need all that JavaScript, I promise. And she said, what does that mean? Well, this is what it means. One of the things we should talk about is performance. I suspect you've heard lots of people talk about web performance, yes? Yeah, nods from the audience. Why is it important? Well, one of the reasons, this is Alex Russell. Anyone recognise him? He works for Google Chrome. Does lots of cool work from him. If you don't care about the performance of your web apps, the things that you're building, then you'll make Alex very, very sad indeed, which is not good. And then he will come around your house and set fire to you with his mind, which you don't want at all. But if you need better reasons than that, there are plenty. So let's talk about first meaningful paint, which is a phrase that I suspect a lot of you will have heard. There's a guy called Zach Leatherman, and he tested a client-side rendered React website displaying a tweet of his against a plain HTML file rendering a tweet of his in order to time them, see which one was faster, see which one was more performant, which one got things on the screen faster. Oh, no, hang on. No, sorry, I read that wrong. He tested a React site containing one tweet against an HTML file containing every single one of his tweets, all 27,000 of them, 8.5 megabytes of HTML against a React site rendering one single tweet. Ask yourselves, which one was quicker? Now, the fact that it's in this talk is probably indicative of what the answer is, but the answer is, not surprisingly, the HTML was quicker. Let's let Zach speak for himself. He measured first meaningful paint time for an 8.5 megabyte HTML file, full text of all of his tweets, versus a client-rendered React site with one tweet, and 8.5 megs of HTML wins by a few hundred milliseconds. Right? Another example, code highlighting. Some of you may have heard of Remy Sharp. He runs FFconf in the UK, smart guy generally. He did some work with syntax highlighting. So he wanted to display code in his blog, I think it was. And his intention was to say, should I render it on the server into HTML, or should I just serve the code and then highlight it client-side with Prism.js was the thing he was looking at. And what he discovered when he sat down and worked it out is if you server render it first, so you're serving twice as much HTML because the HTML you're serving, the code you're serving is all marked up already. You're not just serving plain code, you're serving marked up code, but the total transfer size was smaller, even with all that markup in it. And there's practically, Remy says, there's practically zero impact on passing time, even though the parsed HTML is twice the size when you're server-side rendering. It is kind of tempting to essentially outsource the work that you need to do from your computer to the world's largest distributed computer, which is the web, right? If you don't do it on the server, which you have to pay for, then you can just put it client-side. Everyone does it individually. That work isn't on you, and that's all good. But the problem is the work doesn't go away. You're just making everyone else do it instead of you. And, honestly, the machine they're doing it on, whether that's their phone or a laptop, is almost certainly less powerful than the machine that you're doing it on when you're building the thing in the first place. So, this is Alex again. The takeaway here is that you literally can't afford desktop or iPhone levels of JavaScript if you're trying to make good web experiences for anyone but the world's richest users. Their computers aren't as good as yours are, right? Phones are mostly rubbish. So let's pick another thing. Common argument against this is we'll just serve less stuff. This is what we need to do. This is what tree shaking is for, and bundling and compression and minification. Make sure there's less on the wire so we're not blocking people up. And you have a willing partner. If you want to serve less stuff, you have a willing partner in that, which is the network, because the network hates you and wants you to suffer. And so with that in mind, we should talk about availability. So GDS, the Government Digital Service in the UK, people who run all the government's websites, kind of, they did a survey. They did a lot of instrumentation on stuff they were serving, and the clients that were using it, the people who were using it, and so on. And they discovered about 1.1% of the people visiting their sites weren't getting the JavaScript enhancements that were part of that site. Okay? And you think to yourself, well, okay, 1%, I mean, not that big a deal. Obviously, it's sad for those people, but realistically, we have deadlines to meet, and we can't be doing all this work for people who turn JavaScript off. They've opted out of the web, so that's not our fault. We've got almost everyone is good. One person isn't out of 100, and we'll just have to go, well, that's sad, but we'll manage. They're not part of our supported group. But the key point is, it's not like this. This is not a description of what it looks like. The proportion of people that have explicitly disabled JavaScript or use a browser that doesn't support JavaScript only make up a small slice of the people who don't run the JavaScript. Most of the people who didn't get the JavaScript should have done. They're not using links, right? Or browsing with JavaScript turned off. Someone not getting the JS that you've written, that you're serving, does not necessarily mean that they've deliberately opted out of doing so. I wrote a page called Everyone Has JavaScript, right? And the idea was it walks you through all the reasons. You're not necessarily supposed to read this, right? This is tiny writing. But the idea behind it is it walks you through kind of a flowchart of reasons why the JavaScript you've written and are serving doesn't necessarily arrive to the user. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. Like, the page hasn't loaded yet, which means your JavaScript hasn't loaded yet. All your users are non-JavaScript while they're still downloading your JavaScript. Jake Archibald said that. Sky in the UK are an ISP, Internet Service Provider, and they blocked jQuery. Did it by accident. But nonetheless, a whole bunch of sites stopped working when they blocked the jQuery CDN. Comcast in the US started at one point inserting adverts into your JavaScript, which broke some of it. And obviously, these things are all bad. But you need to be thinking in terms of what happens when that happens. Even if you can point the finger and go, it's your ISP's fault, you still don't have a happy customer. It's a happy user, a happy reader. And that's what you're aiming for, right? What we care about is the user experience. And the user experience of your site doesn't load is bad regardless of whether it's your fault or someone else's. Whether it's the user has chosen to use Chrome's data saver mode because they've got a capped plan on their phone, or it's their ISP has decided to turn stuff off, or the CDN has fallen over for the 1 minute in a month that it does so. Doesn't matter. So it's actually like this. It's not 1% of people who don't get your stuff. It's 1% of visits. The people who don't get it, the people where your site fails to load properly, aren't someone on a terrible capped connection on the other side of the world. They're you in a cellar bar, or on the train just as it goes into a tunnel, or on terrible conference Wi-Fi, which is not the case here, it turns out. Worse, it might actually be like this, because You go and try a site and it doesn't work, and you go, no, I'll hit refresh, or because we're techies, you toggle your phone into airplane mode and back out again, and then it works. Something like that. But most people, if they try it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and it doesn't work, they won't come back. Because they can't even put their finger on why they don't like it. It just feels a bit shaky, a bit shonky. And they'll say, the native app doesn't do that. And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But that's what happens. People end up stepping away. But here's the other thing. And this is, I think, more important, about the supposedly modern web. It's really, really difficult to use, really, really difficult to write for, really, really difficult to build. I mean, can you keep up with all this stuff? A question for you. Those of you who are web developers or have built things for the web and feel like you have a good understanding of all the technologies you're supposed to understand in order to be a modern web developer, put your hand up. Seriously? Could I have your business card? Talk to that guy, people. It's not just me saying this, it's not just you saying this. So this is Drew McClellan, who is half of the team who build Noticed and Perch. He does 24 Ways at Christmas. He says, increasingly there seems to be a sense of fatigue within our industry. Just when you think you've got a handle on whatever the latest tool or technology is, something new comes out to replace it. This is Owen Williams. The web's incredible. I'm not sure every app needs to be a React-based single-page application because the complexity is so great in a product's infancy. He's feeling overwhelmed by the choices he has as a modern developer, always feeling like there's something we should be doing better. This is Garrett Damon, talking about build tools and NPM and different JavaScript dialects and Sass, and they do solve some shortcomings with front-end technologies, but at what cost? For every hour the new stuff has saved him, they cost him another hour in troubleshooting or upgrading. It's not actually saving him any time. This is, go again. I could have broken out any text editor and FTP program, built a full site with HTML and CSS in the time it took me to get it all running, and it would have been easier to maintain in the long run. Because when you go back to a project after somewhere in between 5 minutes and a year, you don't find that all your dependencies are massively out of date. Again, maybe some of you have not had that experience. Maybe all your stuff's up to date all the time. That's fantastic. So this is Rachel Andrew, the other half of the team who are building Perch and Noticed. And she says, I can still take a complete beginner and teach them to build a simple web page with HTML and CSS in a day. We don't need to talk about tools, don't need to talk about frameworks or pull requests or using NPM. Just need a text editor and a few hours. This is how we make things show up on a web page. In 2007, I stood on a stage in London, talk that Bruce was at, actually. And I said increasingly people were making links in their pages, which weren't links at all, and they looked like this. A whole bunch of weird XML HTTP request code. Anyone else in here old enough to remember ActiveX Object and Microsoft.xml HTTP? A few of you. Wow, half the room. We are the soldiers. Yes, we are. I remember that. It's not like that anymore. It's fantastic. The point is, what I said was, this isn't a link. A link looks like this, right? An A element. That's what it's for. And people have listened. Stood there on that stage. Everyone has now listened. Links no longer look like this. Instead, they look like this, which is completely different. Why? Why are we doing this? The thing that I'm describing, the complicated world that we currently inhabit and want to work with, why have we built it as an industry? We'll take a step back, right? Get a sense of the bigger picture. There are reasons, and they're good reasons, right? This stuff is important, so component reuse is an important one. If you talk to people and say, why are you using all this stuff? I can pick up a component that someone's already written and just drop it into my site and it works. And that's really useful. You don't have to build everything from scratch anymore. There are libraries of existing code that you can pull in, which will integrate with other libraries, with stuff you've already written, with the underlying framework that you're using. And again, in theory, hopefully, will save you time. And that's important. You're working from a consistent starting point. This is the same thing that JavaScript libraries like jQuery and all the other old stuff that nobody uses anymore, prototype and scriptaculous and what have you. All these kinds of things, what they gave you was a level playing field, something to start from where you could work to that API rather than being very browser specific. And that's a good thing. It lets you apply some organizational structure to your application. So if you're building something large, then you can't just chuck it all in one JavaScript file anymore, right? You want to build this with software engineers. And so you want to apply engineering principles. And being able to section off your thing into separate modules and pull them in as and when required, and then have the build system, the build tools take care of including the bits you need, this is all important stuff. What we defined as best practices. But to me, these all seem like after-the-fact rationalizations. We didn't say, we want all of that stuff on the previous slide, therefore we will build frameworks to get it. What we did was we built frameworks and then went, why did we build this? Here's a bunch of reasons. They're after-the-fact rationalizations. So given that we've decided as an industry to do things this way, what do we get out of it? And you have to understand, Neo, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. Many of them are so inured, so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight to protect it. Are you listening to me, Neo? Or are you looking at the framework in the red dress? Look again. I'm glad you like that because I left my sunglasses on my desk at home and I was meant to put them on. I think the reason people started inventing client-side frameworks is this. A long time ago, when you clicked on a link, the page went white. Because the browser went, you're navigating to a new screen, so navigating to a new URL, so I'll blank the page, and then as it loads in, I'll progressively load that page in. Right? That's how it works. Browsers don't do that anymore, but it's how it used to work. And essentially what that is it's a loss of control. You say, okay, the user clicks on a link, control goes away from my app to the browser, which is hosting it. And then the browser loads a URL, and then it gives control back to me again. And we don't like that, right? We're looking to provide a consistent, great user experience, and the way to do that is to be in control of every aspect of that user experience. And handing over control to the browser and then getting it back again breaks that. And we don't like the loss of control, and we are right to not like it.
I'm a control freak!
But people wanted to keep that kind of control, to give their users a good experience. And so what we internalize from that as an industry is page loads are bad. Because you lose control, everything gets rebuilt, all your state gets thrown away. We don't like page loads, so we must stop loading pages. So you say to yourself, well, we've got this loss of control where we hand off control to the browser and then get it back. So what about if instead of that, instead of giving the browser URL, letting it load it, and then we get control back when it's done it, what about if we did the loading? How about if we fetch these days, it was XHR back then. What about if we XML HTTP request the stuff off the server, and then inner HTML it into the page ourselves? Because then we've got control over the whole experience. We're not handing it off and getting it back. We'll just re-implement loading. That's nice and easy. JavaScript can do that. And then we can do it however we want. And then someone says, but when we do that, we're injecting a bunch of HTML into our pages, but some of that's already there. I mean, the header's there, and that hasn't changed. And that seems kind of wasteful. So you invent the virtual DOM, where instead of pushing things directly into the browser, you push it into the virtual DOM, and then it calculates what's changed and what hasn't. And then you say, but when we do this, we've re-implemented loading, the URL doesn't change anymore because we haven't actually navigated to a new page. And so you invent client-side routing and the HTML5 history API. Right? And at that point, you are a framework. You have built a framework at this point. It's a pyramid. One thing built on the next, built on the next, built on the next, built on the next. But importantly, it's a pyramid all balanced on one tiny, tiny point. That we want to control the loading experience. So what if you could control the loading experience without having to re-implement page loading yourself? This is what Portal is for. Oops, Portal. Thank you. Right. Basically, a portal is an iframe that you can navigate into. That's it. So this is a picture from web.dev. And you see here, kind of a different page comes up in what essentially looks like an iframe. And then when it's clicked on, the browser navigates into it. Okay, that's all it does. It's a very simple building block technology. Rather than it being something huge and complicated, it's a small building block which we can build on to build cooler things. So, live demo. Prepare yourselves for it not working. Dun, 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 dun. I want that one. Oh, there's interesting. If it's full screen, you can't see the tab bar. Hang on. Yeah, there we go. So what I want to do. Bloody thing. Right. So. I forgot about that. So pretend that has the GOTO website in it while I very, very briefly connect to the Wi-Fi. Actually, no, it'll be fine. It demonstrates it fine without it. It's still a portal, it's loaded, and I click navigate, and it actually navigates into that page. Now, that page is obviously bloody useless because I'm not connected to the Wi-Fi. But you can see the principle behind it. Let me very briefly... Shut up. Connecting to the Wi-Fi. This is what I get for not testing. What's it called? BC Guest. I am now connected to the network. BC Guest. Do I have to do something to liven it up? NeverSSL.com. I need to find whoever did that and buy them 1,000 beers. We're not, right. Thank you for your patience. So let's try this one. Okay, so on this one, we create a portal, which works this time. But in this occasion, because the portal is just an HTML element, we can do what we want with it. So, on this one, instead of just immediately navigating into the portal, I'll use CSS to grow it to the size of the screen and then navigate into it. But that's not built into the browser or anything. That's just me choosing to do that. So if I click navigate into it, you should zoom up. And then, and you see the URL's changed, and that's not HTML5 history API trickery. That's because we actually navigated into that page. So if I go back to here, right, so for the first one, that's the code. We create a portal, just like you create an iframe, set its source, just like an iframe, and then it has a magic new method, portal.activate, which means navigate into it. Make the thing that's in the portal, the thing that's in the iframe, be the main page. Now, you need browser support for this. This is flat out not possible to do without the browser helping you do it. So this is not something you can polyfill, unfortunately. We need actual support in there, but that's how it works. But as I say, because it's just JavaScript under our control, after you've created the portal, you can do what you like. So, the animated version, all I did was I just set, define the portal to exist bottom corner of the screen, bog standard CSS, and set a class on it to make it zoom up. That's all just CSS transforms. I didn't do anything special there. That's all completely standard stuff. It's got nothing to do with it being a portal. You can do that with anything. And that's the principle. And then the code, all I did was, instead of activating the portal immediately, set the class, wait for the transition to end, then activate the portal. That's all. Because, again, that's just standard CSS that all of you who are web people know how to do already. But I don't want to just sort of wave my hands at you theoretically. I want to talk about actual problems. So let's look at an actual problem that I thought this would be useful for. So there's a web framework, I'll call it. I'm not going to name which one because I haven't proposed this solution to them yet. But they've got a documentation page. And the documentation page is in two panes. Left-hand pane is the table of contents. Right-hand pane is the content. Clicking on a link in the left-hand pane shows that thing in the right-hand pane. Okay? And I said, why is it not all separate pages? You don't need any JavaScript for this at all, right? Just make them all be completely separate pages. Then you can, if you want to, you can just then deploy them to Netlify or something if you want, right? You need no server-side stuff for this. You need no JavaScript stuff for this. This is just HTML. This is what the web's for, documents, right? And they said, you can't do that because it forgets the scroll position. The left-hand pane, if you have to scroll down in it to get to the link you want and then click on that link, if that loads a whole new page with a new left-hand pane on it, that left-hand page will be scrolled up to the top because it's a new page. And I went, that's a good point. So how do we solve this? Next answer, frame sets, right? This is what frame sets are for, surely. And there are a couple of reasons why not to use frame sets.
Tonight I'm gonna party like it's 1999.
That's one of the reasons not to use frame set. But a more important reason, and this is one of the big reasons we stopped using frame sets in the first place, is they don't change the URL either. When you, those of you who haven't ever used frame sets, first of all, great. But secondly, the way they work is you define a top-level page which has frame set elements in it, and then the frames load inside there like iframes. But what that means is that your URL is always the URL of the top-level page. So if you click a link in the left-hand frame and target it to load in the right-hand frame, the actual URL shown in the browser is just the one of the frame set page to begin with. So that doesn't work either. So do we build an SPA for this? Right? Do we really need a framework and a single-page app just to do this? Right? And the reasons not to do that are, you know, all the talks so far. So the next step, and a whole bunch of you in the audience will be thinking exactly the same thing that I did, which is let's do a bunch of hacky JavaScript, where when you click on the link, what it does is it reads the scroll position and then, I don't know, stores it in local storage or something. And then when a page loads, it looks in local storage for a scroll position. If there is one, it scrolls the left-hand pane to that position or something. And anyone out there will have thought of 4 or 5 similar ways, probably better than that, to do it. And the reason not to do that is it's just sad. I mean, surely we can do better than this. And this is where I think the portal stuff is useful. Because in that particular occurrence, what you do is you have them all as separate pages, and then when you click on a link, you load the next page in a portal, and then tell it the scroll position with post message. At which point, it can then scroll its frame, and then you navigate into it. The important thing about Portal, the thing which is different from everything we've had so far, is you have access to the page you are on and the page which is coming next at the same time, which up until now you haven't had that. Once you've handed off control to the browser, when someone clicks on a link, you don't have access to both of them at the same time. You know, you've given up control, so you're no longer running anything, and then when the next page arrives, it gets to take over control. But there's no simultaneous access. And yes, SPAs give you that at the cost of making you re-implement everything that the browser does. You essentially build your own browser in JavaScript inside the browser. So one of the things that I think Portal is useful for is precisely this kind of use case. So, another demo, prepare yourselves. Where the hell's my mouse pointer? No, this is not a joke. Literally, where is my mouse? Ah, there it is. Right, so here's our two-page thing. Again, you don't have to read the writing, don't worry about it. But there's our scrolly left-hand pane, and here's our main content page. And if I navigate to the second thing, does what you'd expect. But it's loaded a whole new page. If you probably can't read the URL, but the URL is actually a different URL entirely, and that's a whole different page. It's not kept the same page and dynamically modified bits of it in the DOM. It's just a completely new navigation. And I can do the same thing with third, like that. Again, same thing. And if I switch back to there, the key point about this is the pages themselves are just plain HTML. I didn't change anything about them. I just used an extra little bit of JS to enhance how they work, progressive enhancement, right? If your browser supports it, you get that experience. If it doesn't matter, because the plain HTML pages still work. So again, this is the code, which you don't have to worry about. And the writing's all terribly small. But essentially all we do is when you click on a link, we trap the click, open the page you've clicked on in a portal, and then when we send it the activate message, we also send it the left-hand scroll bar position. It then scrolls its left-hand pane to that position as it activates. That's it. So just adding that bit of JavaScript on top of the existing plain HTML pages gets you the nice experience that you want, but you're enhancing documents. You're not, there's no build step for this. I didn't install anything from NPM. That's all the code. No dependent libraries or anything, which is really handy. Now, I do have a caveat or two about this. The first thing is, Portal is, as far as I'm aware, not on the standards track. The Chrome people just invented it one day. They are looking, I believe, to get it onto the standards track, but at the moment, it's non-standard. The second thing is, it's only available in Chrome, and only super recent versions of Chrome at that, until, I think until about mid-September, it was only available in Chrome Canary. Now it's in stock Chrome, but it's also behind a flag, right? So the universe is conspiring to stop you using this stuff. But it's coming, I believe. And I think there are a whole bunch of use cases where we could do this and we don't need all the complex stuff. I can think of a whole bunch of sites which are using SPAs that don't need to be at all. But they want to because they want to keep that experience of, I want to load things in dynamically. I want to slide from one page to the next, or want to fade in between things or something. Handling page transitions, handling the idea of how you navigate between one thing and the next is a lot of what people are using single page apps for, and they don't need to be. So most of the time, perhaps, you only want to add sprinkles of interactivity to an existing page. The majority of websites aren't and don't need to be single-page apps. And that's not me saying that. That's a direct quotation from React's own website. Right? The React people don't want you to use React for everything. And fair play to them. They said, React has been designed from the start for gradual adoption. And you can use as little or as much React as you need. Building components is great. Reusable components are fantastic. You do not need to have every site start off with the create React app command. Just don't need it. So this is a tiny example. I'm not going to particularly show you the code, but it's using Vue components. But it's a standard HTML page which just the colored buttons in there are a Vue component. It's designed to show you the status of something. And that's a really nice thing. Right? I wouldn't want to have to implement that myself. It's dead handy. It's got a convenient API that I can use it to ask the status, so on and so forth. I can just use it inside a page. Right? And that's all the code. But the point is that the page itself is not owned and constructed by Vue, which means that if your JavaScript doesn't load, or your ISP decide to block it, or you go into a train tunnel just before it's going to get there, the page still works. The structure of the thing is still there. You're enhancing it with components, with extra added stuff that you didn't have to write, and that's good. But you're not critically reliant on it. which means that even though Googlebot these days now knows how to read JavaScript, it's still faster if it doesn't have to. And the other thing is that HTML itself is smarter than it used to be. Those of you who saw Bruce's talk will be well aware of this, but bear with me. HTML on its own now does a whole bunch of stuff that you used to have to build by hand as components, that you'd reach for a library for because that was all there was. So this is the data list element, for example. So one of the things that people have always wanted is what Visual Basic programmers would call a combo box. I think it's a box that you can type into and has a drop-down list, which just wasn't possible in HTML for years and years and years and years and years. People wanted it, but you couldn't have it. So there was a whole bunch of quite hacky JavaScript implementations which did this, some of which were better than others, some of which were actually quite good. But part of the issue with building this kind of thing yourself client-side is there's a whole bunch of stuff which the browser does which may not make it up to the top of your priority list. There's accessibility work. There's what happens if you're using right-to-left languages in that combo box. What do you do with Unicode characters? There's a whole bunch of stuff like that the browser does, but if you build it yourself, it's kind of, oh yeah, we really ought to fix that, but there aren't that many right-to-left speakers in our audience, so we'll get to it at some point. Getting this stuff into the browser, getting it standardized, essentially makes it better. So, Stuart. It's me, man. So, another silly example, field set disabled. So you can now, click, disable a whole field set in one go. So a whole bit of a form, rather than walking through and setting the disabled element on all the things in it, just put things in a field set and then disable the field set, disables everything within it. It's a simple example, but it's the sort of thing where I suspect half of us have probably written a little JavaScript loop to do that, and HTML does it for you now. So, another example, CSS scroll snap. Has anyone built a carousel? Bunch of hands, right? Building a carousel is really annoying for two reasons. First of all, clients shouldn't want it. And secondly, there's a whole load of fiddly edge cases. Now, the CSS people have implemented scroll snap, which means that when you scroll through things, it snaps to the next scroll position. Like that. And it does it for you. And there's a whole bunch of different things you can set up. But the point is that now, implementing a carousel, should you be required to do so, is trivially easy because this stuff is built into CSS. Don't go looking for a carousel component which does it all itself. Right? Build your stuff as HTML and CSS and then enhance it if you need to, absolutely. Totally. But you don't have to implement a lot of these things from scratch anymore. It's not that these things I'm describing are super revolutionary. Obviously, they're not. They're trivial little examples. None of them are huge game changers. But it's that they would have required a whole bunch of JavaScript, and now they don't. But importantly, I am not saying don't use JavaScript. I love JS. It's fabulous. I spent most of my career writing it, and it's really good. So this is Anna Tudor. And she says, just because you don't understand a simple little CSS solution, it doesn't mean it's weird or crazy. And it goes the other way as well. Adding a ton of extra elements just for the sake of having pure CSS is silly when you should have just updated the value from the JavaScript. Don't hide away from JS. It's a great language. Just don't necessarily make it be first, last, and only tool that you reach for, because it's hard. Stay in touch with the latest tricks in the industry. Definitely. Right? We're in a fast-moving industry, but stay in touch with all of them. Don't just stay in touch with the latest library or GitHub. Stay in touch with what HTML's doing, what the browser's doing as a whole, which APIs the browser platform is providing for you, so you don't have to build them yourself or pick a library to do that. Or don't, if you don't want to. Right? Not knowing stuff is normal. Not using new and shiny tech is okay. Feeling bad for not knowing them is common. You are not alone, but you are also completely and perfectly fine, and you are adequate. It's important, I think, to fight the right fight. There's so much in our industry and in the rest of the world that needs fighting. There's so many ways we need to stand in solidarity with people in our industry, people in the rest of the world, the users that we want to defend, that we want to bring great experiences to. If you want to fight, spend that energy in good ways. That's a brilliant idea. Don't fight the web itself. That's not the right fight. Frameworks are a great way to prototype stuff before it reaches standardization. Standardizing a thing takes ages, and it takes ages for a good reason. So all the stuff I mentioned earlier about accessibility and internationalization and localization and testing it in all sorts of different environments and with weird edge cases and so on, that takes a long time. It really, really does. So if you want to show up somewhere and say, I've invented an idea for a new element and everyone agrees, it's not going to show up in user-facing browsers for years. Bruce invented the picture element. Serious question, how long did it take from conception to it showing up where I could use it?
5 years until it was in all the browsers.
Yeah, 5 years. That's how long it takes. It takes a long time to standardize things. And building stuff with a framework as a component, emulating the behavior in JavaScript, polyfilling, is a brilliant way to get it in people's hands without having to wait for that. And absolutely, definitely do that. Right? And maybe you don't need to be quite as concerned, depending on your audience, with things like the performance of it. If you don't want to be, you can make that choice. You can make that business decision. But, yeah, sometimes you need to be there. You need to be ahead of what the standardization people are doing. You've got needs. They need to be delivered now. You don't want to wait 5 years for the web itself to embrace this. You need to get on with things. So be on the leading edge. Yeah, absolutely. But are you always on the leading edge all the time? I don't think there are that many people who permanently need to be on the leading edge. Sometimes, yeah, great. But for everything, I mean, for building a login form, it doesn't seem that convincing to me. So, my darling daughter, you asked the question, and probably got a longer answer than you bargained for. But now you know. It's valuable what we do as an industry. We have the power to bring knowledge to the whole world, to connect people together when they want to be connected together. We're building the greatest repository of information that's ever been known. And I want to keep it that way. That's what I think is important about the web. I love you, darling daughter. Daddy. Stuart. Thank you very much.